Hey everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Philip Heidson. I'm the Managing Director here at Art of Procurement, and I want to welcome you to today's industry webinar. We're actually talking about the manufacturing industry today, and our topic is Does, Should, Could, Cost Optimization for World-Class Manufacturing. We're going to be talking about the importance of should-cost analysis in the manufacturing industry, as we'll be talking about some of the challenges and opportunities of should-cost analysis and doing should-cost analysis at scale, and then opportunities to collaborate with key suppliers through the should-cost analysis process. We also invite you to ask any question throughout today's webinar. And my colleague, Kelly, welcome, Kelly.
Good morning. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
How are you doing today?
Just fine.
Well, Kelly's going to be keeping an eye on all the questions as they come in at the beginning part of the webinar, and then Kelly's going to take over some of the questioning as well as we get towards the end of the webinar. So do please keep those questions coming in. There should be a box underneath this video where you can actually go and ask your question. Those will come in straight to us. So this is a topic that's really interesting for me. I spent a lot of time earlier in my career in the manufacturing industry and working with my cost engineering team on should cost models. It was always interesting to see the difference between the reality of a quotation that came in versus what the should cost model said it should be. And there's a lot of tension that would happen. So I'm really interested to kind of talk a little bit about that and how we can close the gap and make those should cost analysis a lot more kind of, use them in a way which really drives impact. So I'm going to introduce you to our guest. Our guest is Yushiro Kato. Yushiro is the co-founder and CEO of CADDi. So without further ado, let's start the conversation. Hi there, Yushiro. Thank you so much for joining us today on today's webinar.
Thank you very much for having me here today.
Now, we've got a lot of things to cover over the next 40 minutes or so. And so let's get straight into it. And the first question that I had is, as we talk about your philosophy on procurement, you really are, I think, passionate about creating stability for buyers and suppliers of manufactured parts and that kind of relationship. What's the greatest challenges that you see of suppliers and buyers actually kind of creating that collaboration?
So we are kind of a procurement platform that kind of matches buyers and suppliers. And yes, as you said, stability is very important. One of the biggest challenges we have, or I see, in the current 2-3 years, is that is demand fluctuation. So basically, demand is fluctuating a lot, especially after COVID.
Yeah.
For example, for semiconductor machinery industry, they surged 50% from 2021 to 2022, but it's down by 30% because of the political issue between the US and China now. So how to handle this kind of demand fluctuations is really key, especially from buyers point of view. Of course, they need to secure the capacity, but if when they do not have a good forecast of the volume, then of course it's very hard for them to tell the supplier, hey, this is the demand we are foreseeing, right? And let's please secure this capacity and so on. And from supplier's perspective, of course, if demand fluctuates, that impacts their utilization rate, right? And fixed cost is 50-60% of their total cost, so it fluctuates a lot. So that is one of the biggest challenges I see in the current 2-3 years.
Yeah, I remember even in what you would consider more normal times, there's always difficulty in demands actually meeting with the reality and everything that goes into pricing discussions around it because of, you said, of utilization, of amortization of tooling. There's all kind of things that go into the way that a price is structured over a 5-year contract that's based on the demand that you're providing as a buyer being at least directionally accurate, rather than kind of wildly off, which unfortunately some of our estimates were, in circumstances that I had. Because of the pandemic and because of that, the roller coaster of demand, if you will, are you seeing that more companies now are moving away from a just-in-time philosophy to holding more inventory in stock?
Yeah, so in the last year or 2 years ago, it was really difficult for buyers to buy parts, especially semiconductor chips. So they started to have a lot of inventories and safety stocks rather than keeping like just-in-time myth, right? And that's probably Toyota started. So now I see some companies shifting back to just-in-time methods, but of course, if you lose your capacity or lose your inventory, that means you will miss revenue opportunities, right? So there's an opportunity loss in the revenues, which is probably more difficult or more challenging for top management. So actually, from my perspective, procurement team was kind of undervalued at least 3 years ago or 4 years ago. But actually now top management is really keen on having securing the capacity, and sometimes they promote some of the head of procurement to executive level and so on. So that's change I've seen in the last 2 years. So basically, to answer your question, yes, some companies shifting back to safety, just in time, but I would say more than 50% of the company have safety stock. For now, yeah.
And it's a positive to hear that the role of procurement is being elevated in a lot of the organizations that you are working with. But when you think about safety stock versus just in time, it's not necessarily something you can just flick a switch on, because your whole supply chain, your whole inventory, the logistics is all based around you don't have the capacity to hold all this safety stock even. So I can see why organizations would be wanting to move back to just in time as much as they possibly could.
Yeah, so if you have safety stock, of course, you should pay inventory cost and interest rates, and probably some inventory losses, defects. But that revenue loss or opportunity loss in revenue is more significant than having paying for that kind of money. So yeah.
Have you seen be a difference in the way that large manufacturing companies are operated versus small manufacturing companies?
Yes and no, but for some, generally speaking, of course, large manufacturing companies it takes longer to make a decision, right? So it's kind of interestingly, smaller manufacturers were kind of more agile to change your suppliers to adapt to the situation after COVID. So I would say probably more larger manufacturers have suffered from the sudden changes from the COVID because of the decision-making processes.
And just one last question on kind of the current state of affairs, if you will, of manufacturing as you're observing it. There's a lot of talk around I don't know if the word reshoring is the right word, but the moving of supply chains so they become more local. Is that something that you're seeing, or are you seeing that there's certain locations that companies are moving away from manufacturing and into that may still be, the other side of the world, but they're diversifying the countries that they buy from? Is that something that you see?
Yes, I see that. So of course, China is obviously one of the countries with biggest impact from after COVID or after geopolitical issues occurred. So basically, especially the U.S. company or European or Japanese companies, started to avoid sourcing from China, and the demand actually goes into 3-4 countries: Vietnam, Thailand, India, and Mexico.
Okay.
From the U.S. point of view, so the biggest difference between Asian countries like Thailand, India, and Vietnam and Mexico is that material cost is actually very different. Because Mexican suppliers import most of their materials from the U.S. That means, of course, labor cost is cheaper or lower, but actually material cost is higher than the U.S. because there's transportation costs on top. But on the other hand, Thailand, Vietnam, India, they import materials from China or Malaysia, or for Indian suppliers, they sometimes use Indian steel makers. So material cost is also a lot lower, and labor cost is lower. So basically, that's a trade-off between using closer suppliers in Mexico or probably in the U.S., or you will still try to buy parts from Asia with lower cost.
So go ahead, Kelly.
Sir, I was just going to jump in. It's interesting, and we're going to come back to some of this later in the conversation. But when we think about what we know, and I'm doing air quotes, which is terrible. Sorry for everybody listening in later, about manufacturing and supply chains. It's that in the wake of the pandemic, we know everyone has given up just in time forever. And we know that everyone is going to reshore, nearshore, or friendshore everything. Right. And so some of these trends that everyone just accepts as happening everywhere, these massive trends, everything is so much more complicated in real life. And so especially as we start to talk about, what percentage of the procurement community are using what strategies and tactics to deal with these challenges, it's interesting because the things that we all know are happening everywhere, which in reality are not, there's an imbalance there between the things that are available to us to address those conditions that we should all know about, but don't. So there's sort of this funny information dynamic that's going on. I think that sets a really interesting sort of front piece to the conversation we're going to have today.
Yeah. So yes, it is said that people are going to reshoring or sourcing from the U.S. suppliers. But actually, as you said, it's more difficult than just saying reshoring is important, right?
Absolutely.
So of course, supply chain is it cannot be built within 1 day or two, 1 week, right? So it's actually hard for them to switch the suppliers, because if there's the relationship between customers and suppliers are like 10 years, 20 years. So so it's actually difficult. It's more difficult to. So that's why we provide procurement platform that diverse your supply chain or change your supply portfolio easily by securing and assuring quality. So quality assurances and delivery assurance are one of the biggest challenges for when it comes to switching suppliers, right?
Yeah.
And I'm really interested about, actually, you said one of the countries was India that you see more and more manufacturing moving towards. Do you see that India is becoming more of a viable destination for export? Historically, I think the Indian market has been very, everything manufactured there has been for local consumption. And not everything, that's kind of an unfair generalization, but a lot of manufacturing in India is for local consumption. Because of logistics challenges, I think more first and foremost.
Yeah.
Do you see that India now is becoming more viable as an export destination for supply chain in Asia?
Yes, definitely. So India's, I think, one of the most growing country in Asia, especially in the manufacturing. So the Prime Minister is really focusing on growing their manufacturing industry. The investment level is like, I forgot, about $100 billion or something like that per year or something, right? So basically now I see some companies in the U.S. Trying to buy parts from India, and Indian companies are trying to export more materials or more casting parts and sheet metal parts to the rest of the world. So yes, that's actually definitely a trend.
It's interesting because I've often thought there's so much potential. So for context, I used to live there for about a year, and so you would see the opportunity, but there was always challenges from a logistics perspective. So with that investment going in, it opens up, a new region essentially for exports in Asia that was previously more, like say, for local consumption. Now, I want to move on to talk about the key theme for today's conversation, which is should cost modeling. And while I'm sure that everybody on the call knows what a should cost model is, I feel like I always have to ask it just for a definition perspective. So if you could just talk a little bit about what you mean when we're talking about should cost modeling. Okay.
So should cost modeling, should cost analysis is kind of an approach to estimate the cost you are buying from your suppliers. So by breaking it down to cost components, including like material costs, labor costs, amortization or depreciation costs of machineries or toolings, logistics costs, overhead, and profit. And by identifying the gap between your should cost model and the total or actual cost you're buying from your suppliers at. And of course, there's this. Generally speaking, it's there's a huge gap.
Yeah.
And by identifying the gap, you start the discussion with the suppliers where the gap is coming from in a detailed detailed level, like material costs or labor costs, or labor costs for welding, or machinery costs for laser cutting. In this detailed level, you can discuss with suppliers. So that's how you cut costs, but you do not have to you do not have to squeeze suppliers on their margins. You can collaborate with your suppliers to reduce the actual cost they are they are paying, right? That's the should cost analysis.
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent of using like value engineering to actually figure out how to reduce the cost to serve, as opposed to just using models to go and cut all the margins of your suppliers. But I'm interested, if I step back a little bit, look, why is there always a gap? Because it was interesting, when I think about cost models and I think about my experience, I always think my cost engineers told me it was going to be $1 and my supplier is telling me it's going to be $2, for example. There's always a wide gap, and that always leads to an argument. Which we're going to talk a little bit in a minute about how we don't have that occur. But are there reasons why you see big gaps between the should cost and the actual price?
So of course there's some cases where suppliers put more buffer on it, or more profit margin on the cost. But oftentimes the assumption is different. So for example, if the material cost is different, and generally speaking, should cost analysis, the result is lower than the actual cost.
It's not usually the gap's not the other way around, is it?
Yes, and suppliers generally got angry at looking at the should cost model, which is stupid from their perspective. But anyways, so one of the reasons is again this assumption difference. So for example, material cost. So generally, buyers are in larger companies. So basically, their volume is more than suppliers' volume, which impacts the unit price per pound, right? So that's why, or labor costs. Generally speaking, utilization rates for fabrication factories like sheet metal machining is like 50 to 60%. But buyers assume that is 80% or 90%. So they are always assumptional difference, and so that's the first step, right? To understand what is the difference, where the gap is coming from. Then generally assumption. So probably how to fix that assumption. Probably if you can buy material by yourself. Buyers buy the material by yourself with your bargaining power as a company, as a larger company, and then probably provide that to your suppliers. Then of course it will be reduced. So so the answer is assumption.
Yeah. What's the relationship usually look like between procurement and the design teams when you're doing the internal cost models? Is that, I feel like when I was a buyer, that I was like always looking at my design team, the should cost modeling team, my cost engineers, like they're coming back with this number that's so different than what I've negotiated, that they're making my life difficult now, because now I can't justify this price from a supplier because the should cost model is 50% less than what it is. Like, do you see that the level of collaboration internally between design teams and procurement has an impact on what those models look like?
Yeah, definitely. So, of course, collaborating with design team is very important for procurement people, because sometimes it's very difficult to negotiate with the suppliers without any design changes, right? Yeah. So, if, for example, material cost is 80%, it's really difficult to reduce the cost without changing your materials. Yeah. So, basically, first understand the cost components. And then if that is very difficult to reduce the cost at supplier side only, then you should talk to your designers to reduce probably welding length while keeping the strength of the component, or probably change the change the material to lower cost material. So generally speaking, it's said 80% of the cost is determined in design phase. Yeah. So you have just 20% of the opportunity in the commercial phase or negotiation phase or buyer phase. So yeah, it's really difficult, but it's as you said, it's really challenging because designers are more kind of theoretical person. They basically say, okay, this is the should cost analysis, the result, right? So why there's a gap. So it's difficult, but it's very important.
Yeah, one of the challenges I would always see is, and maybe this is as we talk about how technology is changing the way that we can do should cost analysis. I would see in the quoting stage for new business that the sales teams would rely on data from the cost modeling team, who have done these should cost analysis, which are based on perhaps some of those assumptions that are not correct, and so that's what gets baked into the pricing, which is then you win the business on, and then that task is then given to procurement to say, okay, this should be $1 because that was what was built into basically the end price. I think some of that's done because it's not possible to go to suppliers and start the whole quoting process while you're responding to an RFP as a manufacturer. Is the way that technology is impacting the way you can do should cost analysis, changing it so that actually you can have better data to go and help your sales teams go and sell at a more appropriate price than have this big gap further down?
Yeah, so one thing procurement people can leverage technology, like 3D CAD based should cost analysis or auto should cost analysis or such kind of technology, is that one, procurement team can make an excuse. This is not my assumption. This is from the database, right? That's actually very important because for a lot of procurement people, it's kind of reluctant to get reluctant to show their should cost model because they don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah.
And suppliers sometimes get angry looking at it. So that's one thing. And also, of course, there's some technology that can automate the should cost analysis, at least for the first 50% of the process. So of course you can expedite the process, and you can cover more products. So because it's almost impossible to apply should cost analysis to all the parts you're buying, especially in high mix, low volume to mid volume industries. If you're in mass production, like automotives, you generally deal with like 10 parts.
Yeah.
Then of course it's possible, but for low volume industry, they buy like 10,000 parts per year or so.
Yeah.
So it's kind of impossible. So of course, leveraging technology is one of the most useful way to expedite the process and broaden your coverage.
And I have one other question, then Kelly, I'm going to come to you to see if we've got any questions that have come in so far. But when we talk about technology, how is automation actually changing that should cost analysis process?
It depends on technology. So there are some, of course, you can. So for example, for our, in our case, we leverage AI to. So in order to do should cost analysis, you should first extract a lot of information from drawings. For example, dimensions, tolerance, surface treatment, material, and so on. And then you calculate the cost based on your database, and you need to have a solid database and calculation model. So basically, you need to have inputs, calculation model, and database with material costs or suppliers, general utilization rates or labor costs per hour in China and so on. And for input phase, I would say 50-60% of the that phase could be automated. At least for some simpler parts, extracting all the information automatically by leveraging AI. And calculation is basically, generally speaking, it's not like AI based. It's generally algorithm based. So because it's like it's simple formula. Formula itself is very simple. And database, there are some companies with really good database, very comprehensive database with labor information in any country or material information for any material. So basically, I would say in total, 30-40% of the process could be, could be improved.
Okay.
by leveraging technology.
All right, Kelly, anything that's come in, any questions that have come in from the audience so far?
We do have a question that's going to come in. It's actually very extensive. So rather than bringing it up, I'm going to paraphrase a piece of it, and then we can always follow up afterwards. But Yushiro, Paul is asking about sort of the cross-functional work that has to be done when you're starting to use should-cost analysis. I mean, we'll get into these details, but you've shared with us the fact that according to CADDi research, only 28.1% of procurement professionals know what should-cost analysis is. Less than 5% are using it regularly in practice. So any company that's looking to start making use of should-cost analysis has a change management process on their hands. And so what Paul is interested in hearing about is who are the different stakeholder groups that it's important to have involved almost in the conceptual adoption stage, let's say, right? You don't even have a specific product or a specific model that you're looking at yet, but you're starting to introduce the should-cost analysis concept with people internally. Who are the different groups that procurement should be looking to bring along in that conversation?
Yeah, so I would say actually any group, but basically designers, design group and manufacturing group or assembly, and inspection or quality assurance. Those are the three, major groups you should involve in the conversation. So first of all, for designers, of course, again, if you look at the cost breakdown, in some cases, it's impossible to reduce the cost without any design changes. Of course, in that case, you should involve design team. Yeah. And also, again, in order to do should-cost analysis, you should have a kind of a comprehensive input database, like materials and size and information, tolerance and so on. That kind of information can be extracted automatically from your 3D CAD if you use 3D CAD in design team. So in that part, you can also collaborate with your design team. Mm-hmm. And manufacturing, actually, manufacturing team is really, of course, they know more about manufacturing, how to produce the parts. Generally, there are some in-house machineries, in-house processes to produce fabricated parts, for example. So there should be some experts in manufacturing team. So you can get inputs from them. Probably what is the lead time or what is the cycle time to produce this part or to weld this part and so on. And inspection quality assurance is actually also very important because inspection costs in some industries, inspection cost is really huge. For example, for aircraft industry, they need to inspect the parts for, inspect all the parts, all the pieces, each and every piece. So actually, and it depends on the, a percentage of the parts you need to inspect based on the quality level. So you can talk to, quality assurance team, and probably for some parts, you over-conduct inspections. Then probably you can change that constraints, and then so that suppliers spend less time on inspection, but you can statistically keep the same level of quality. So that kind of discussion is very important. So I would say designers, manufacturing team, and inspection or quality assurance team are the biggest team you should involve.
From procurement's point of view, is there any value to having finance play even a remote role? In so many organizations, we are incentivized and measured based on our ability to generate savings. Is there an educational benefit in making sure finance understands, for instance, to your own example, if material costs represent 80% of an item, unless we change materials or drastically change a process, there's only so much procurement can do. Are there sort of peripheral benefits to having maybe finance part of the conversation as well?
Yes, of course, you need to have at least a certain level of knowledge on finance when you do should-cost analysis. For example, because material cost is rather simple. You can just pick up some unit price per pound and you can apply that to should-cost model. But when it comes to, for example, depreciation or amortization cost of machineries.
Yeah.
Of course, you need to have some kind of understanding of what is the, of course, price of machinery and how you amortize that machinery cost within 5 years or 10 years. It actually depends on a country. In Japan, it's generally like 7 years, and in other countries, it's different. So, of course, amortization period is different. The fixed cost per year should be different, right? So that kind of financial knowledge is really important when it comes to cost analysis.
Yeah.
Sorry, Kelly, can I just jump in? I've got a question that just was triggered by the discussion of amortization. So when we're talking about should cost analysis, we're talking about piece price, individual piece price. Mm-hmm. But do you then take should cost analysis to the tooling cost as well? Because obviously that builds into what the amortization cost should be.
Yes, of course you should take tooling into account. So generally, so it depends actually. So buyers sometimes buy toolings in the initial phase and then use that as an asset, or probably rent that to your supplier, even though suppliers made the tooling. You buy the part, you buy the tooling, or you can amortize the tooling cost and let suppliers add some additional costs on top of the piece cost, right? It depends on the customers, but I would say like in automotive industry, customers generally buy toolings in the initial phase, and then so that they can use that toolings to other suppliers if there's any problem happens at the factory for BCP purposes.
They go move the tooling if there's a bankruptcy, for example, with a supplier.
Exactly. But in high mix low volume industry, it's a little different. From my perspective, they generally do amortize and then put additional costs on top of the part cost. But actually, the problem is, of course, that's you can from buyer's perspective, you can reduce the initial investment, but at the same time, generally speaking, amortization cost there's a buffer on it, because if the forecast
demand, right?
Yeah, exactly. Demand fluctuates, then suppliers need to pay more, right? So that's why they put some buffer on it. So it depends on the strategy, but that's how they use tooling cost in should cost analysis.
Sorry, Kelly, for jumping in. Back to you.
No, that's all right. We take questions here. You can ask questions too. A reminder to everybody watching in, you saw our ticker go by. We're going to trade roles. I'm going to ask Yushiro a few questions, and Phil is going to keep an eye on those as they come in. One of the questions that I had wanted to ask, actually, I think plays very nicely on the exchange that you two were just having. And that's this question about the efficiency challenge that suppliers face. So we talked earlier about utilization, but we talked about then fixed costs and how that changes things for them. What is it that procurement might not understand about how all of these fluctuations in demand actually impact the prices that suppliers come to them with?
Yeah, that's actually a very important question. So again, like 50% to 60% of the part cost is based on the fixed cost, including labor cost, amortization cost, or overheads. And the fixed cost is, of course, totally dependent on the volume. So because it's fixed. So basically, for example, if suppliers spend $1 million on fixed cost per month, and if the quantity is 1 million pieces per month, then fixed cost per piece is $1, of course. But if you can increase the volume to 2 million pieces, then the fixed cost per part would be $0.5, right? It's half. So considering the fact that 50%, 60%, let's say 60% of the cost or of the part cost is from this fixed cost, then if that $1 becomes $0.5, then that will reduce 30% of the total cost, right? So it's really huge. So factory is heavily, asset heavy industry. So basically, you need to really consider the total volume you order to the supplier, or probably a total volume they deal with, including the other buyers or other customers. So that's why we generally talk about booking the capacity in advance so that the utilization rate does not really fluctuate. Yeah.
Now, given the fact that suppliers are managing all of this and they're trying to run as efficiently and profitably as possible, you would assume that they have a very sophisticated understanding of all of their different input costs. And yet, as I had mentioned earlier, you shared some of those numbers with us, that it's just over 28% of procurement professionals even know what should cost analysis is, less than 5% are using it. What type of an information or knowledge disadvantage does that put procurement at when approaching a negotiation?
So of course they do not know the actual breakdown of the suppliers. So of course that's one thing. And so generally, should cost analysis is just a starting point. So if you have it doesn't actually mean anything. If suppliers say, okay, I will not disclose any cost breakdown, I will not reduce the cost, your should cost analysis is stupid, and so on. So then of course they that will not reduce the cost at all.
Yeah.
So more important topic than creating a fancy should cost model is to collaborate with the supplier, and then to identify the area where we can reduce the cost. For example, again, material costs or labor costs, assumptions should be different. So how to fix the assumption, by collaborating with them is very important. So yeah, so that's the crucial part. But when you first start creating a should cost analysis, you dive deeper in too much into detail, and then which results in nothing. So that's kind of a pitfall, and the difficulty of should cost analysis.
And yet I think you make a very interesting point. Just because we're talking about the importance of should cost analysis does not mean that this relationship with the supplier or this particular negotiation all boils down to cost. The relationship with the supplier and the approach that's taken once the should cost analysis is complete can be everything from very straightforward tactical approaches to savings to far more partnership-oriented, collaborative relationships based on trust. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the relationship or value-oriented opportunities that can be built once you have that foundational starting point of should cost analysis in place?
So one of the most important parts is when you apply should cost analysis to the actual negotiation with the suppliers is kind of a principle, set up a principle that you will not squeeze their margins. That's actually it, because of course the biggest thing they're afraid of, suppliers are generally afraid about is they being squeezed on their margins. So basically, if you have that kind of principle and you open that principle with the supplier, then suppliers are more, of course, willing to open their actual cost breakdown, and then you can start the discussion. Without having good trust, they will come up with a fake breakdown. Sometimes it actually really happens, right? And also, or they will not just share any information on the breakdown. Yeah. So trust-based relationship with the suppliers is very important, and the key is to say, we will not talk about any portion of your profit, at least profit margin.
Yeah. Well, and it's certainly easier to make something up than it is to say, I have absolutely no idea. What's my cost model? I don't know, right? We haven't dug into it. And if they don't want to share the actual information, I can see where it could easily happen that they would come up with some ballpark or alternate figures, which actually raises another question. What might going through a should cost analysis process teach procurement about either the differences between or the unique advantages associated with individual suppliers? So if, because of the disruption in the supply chain, you're potentially sourcing something from more than one supplier, so you have some built-in redundancy, what might this detailed process actually teach you about the differences between those suppliers?
Detailed process what?
of going through the should cost analysis process of understanding. I mean, certainly the literal things that you find out, what is your cost breakdown? How much overhead do you have? But also, what is it like to work through this process with you? Are you pushing back? Do I suspect that you're maybe making up some numbers just to give me an answer that maybe I want to hear? What are the different types of things that procurement could learn?
So again, should cost analysis is just an analysis. In the end, you want to get the cost reduction from your suppliers, right? So I would say, so don't go into detail. So probably you should just spend, I don't know, 1 or 2 hours to first to have a kind of a draft of should cost analysis, and then just to talk to your suppliers. If you have a good relationship with the suppliers, that's actually enough for one part. So detailed process of identifying material costs by searching that in, I don't know, macro database and so on. That's not really important, I would say, at least for the first step. For the first step, it's important to start a negotiation or discussion with the suppliers, and then get more information from them, and then apply that to your should cost model, and collaboratively build a should cost model with the supplier. So should cost analysis is, I would say, is not a procurement role. It's kind of a collaboration between you and suppliers.
So then, Phil, let me maybe come to you to ask a quick question, and then we'll see if any more audience questions have come in. We've talked about the relationship that procurement has with the supplier, the relationship that procurement has with some of these different internal groups that are involved with conducting the should cost analysis or putting it into practice through design changes. It sounds like it is a pretty mature, influence-driven procurement team that can take something like should cost analysis as a first step and turn it into all of the different types of value, both cost-driven and not. Based on your experience, what can we maybe infer or say about that 4.6% of procurement organizations that not only know what should cost analysis is, but they're actively putting into practice?
Yeah, I think that the maturity, yes, the maturity of a procurement organization speaks to whether should cost models are used at all. But even further, when you think of maturity, it's how they are used. And this is why I love what Yushiro said about the principle of do not squeeze my margins. Because it's really easy to use a should cost model to then go and say, okay, I'm going to use this as a leverage play to go to my supplier and tell my supplier that I know that you're paying your pricing to me is 50% uncompetitive, and these are the reasons I know why. Well, actually, most of the pricing is just market driven. It's what they feel as though is appropriate in the marketplace, and so it's about how you use that information. I think that speaks to maturity. I wanted to speak about something that you just mentioned earlier around what does it mean about the relationship with suppliers, because it does. How your supplier responds also is a huge tell as to what level of trust that they have in you versus them closing the doors. And you said about the conversation around suppliers making stuff up. So, pre-technology, one of the roles I had was to see, we built a team that would gather all this cost, this is in automotive, gather all this cost breakdown information that we'd ask the suppliers to submit. And some suppliers would say, no way, I'm not giving you that, that's proprietary. Some suppliers would begrudgingly give us the information, but they'd have different people filling it in for different parts that we bought. And the same materials, you'd look on one proposal, the different raw material price than the next one. And so clearly they were just kind of thinking what they could get away with. And then you put it all together and you see where all the discrepancies are. But what that does is it drives a relationship of going against each other than it does collaboration, because then you start pointing fingers. Well, I'm going to take the smallest number that you used from every single one of these 5 proposals you wrote, and those are going to be the real facts, and I'm going to use that then against you as an attempt to drive a leverage-based conversation. So I would see that a lot, and that damages the relationship more than it progresses the relationship. But we did have one question that came in. I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit as well. We talked earlier about platforms like what you are doing. CADDi really uses AI to accelerate the process of getting a cost like should cost analysis. does that then mean that it should open up how many parts that we apply should cost analysis and should cost modeling to? So rather than previously, it would be what I believe to be my highest cost or my highest impact parts to actually now I can run everything through this and get a much better idea. Like, how do you see that changing as as platforms like yours can accelerate that should cost analysis process?
Mm-hmm. So generally speaking, so there's some types of parts. One is core parts. One is long tail parts. Core parts is like 20% of the total volume or total parts, number of parts, but accounting for 80% of the cost. So which has more impact. And long tail parts is the rest of the parts, like 80% of the parts, 20% of the cost. So basically, our platform deal with like long tail parts, including sheet metal, machining, wire harnesses. Unit price is low, but the types of the parts is huge. So basically, from procurement people's perspective, of course, if you wanna reduce the cost, you should focus more on core parts because it's 80% of at the end of the day, 80% of the cost is coming from core parts. So, but how to deal with the rest 80%, right? So that's where CADDi is coming in. Yeah. So basically, focus and prioritize, or how to prioritize your total volume you have as a procurement person is very important. And you should not, again, even if you have the technology, you should not apply should cost analysis to all the parts. It's kind of time consuming, right?
But historically, that's the tail. You had no real idea. So you would basically, yes. Today it's a market-based decision. I went out to RFP, I went to 3 suppliers, I went to 5 suppliers, I went to 2 suppliers, whatever it is, and I picked the lowest based on a analysis of the pricing based on the suppliers that I happen to invite to that RFP. Mm-hmm. And that's really the only way So you don't really know what the should cost is. You're just going on a market price. So what you're able to do now is actually have those conversations based on cost as opposed to based on value-based pricing, which is what the suppliers really want to get away with, because that's really where some of the margin comes in.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I know that it's about time to wrap up, Yushiro. So I want to thank you so much for joining us in today's industry webinar here on Art of Procurement. I want to thank everybody for joining us, for submitting the questions that you did. Thank you for that, and apologies for any questions that we weren't able to get to through the conversation. And Kelly, thanks for helping me run and lead the conversation.
Absolutely. And this is a great reminder as we pull up this link here for people to check out other events. If you would like to hear more from Yushiro, then you're going to want to be with us on June 13th at AOP Direct, where we're going to take a slightly different perspective on this topic, but keep exploring the importance of should cost analysis to manufacturing procurement.
Yeah, and that's a great kind of lead in. So to register for AOP Direct, you can just go to artofprocurement.com/calendar. You'll find the link right there and join. We have, I think, 260 plus already will be joining you peers at that event on June the 13th. So one last time, Yushiro, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.